The gavel came down like a gunshot. I said, "Sit down." Judge Carl Denton leaned over the bench, finger pointed directly at the man at the defendant's podium. Tall, broad-shouldered, faded Memphis Tigers t-shirt, worn jeans. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply quietly, calmly asked a question. That was enough. "You people always have an excuse," Denton snapped. "Pay the fine and sit down before I double it." The man opened his mouth. Denton cut him off cold. "What did they teach you, or did anyone bother?" His lips curled slowly. "You walked in here looking like you just rolled off a bus stop bench, and you're going to stand there and lecture me about the law." A woman in the back row pressed her hand over her mouth. Denton leaned back, adjusted his robe like a king, straightening his crown, and dropped his voice to something almost conversational, which somehow made it worse. "People like you come in here thinking this is a debate club. You lost before you walked through that door. The only question is how much it's going to cost you before you accept that." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The man at the podium didn't flinch. He stared back with the kind of stillness that should have made a smarter man nervous. He was being fined $425 for riding a bicycle. What Denton didn't know was that the recording device hidden in the second button of that faded t-shirt had been running for 47 minutes. Every word. Captured. This story will hit you somewhere deep. Stay with me. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're watching this. And if you're not subscribed yet, you really don't want to miss what happens next. Marcus Webb had not always been the kind of man who walked into rooms and made people stand up straighter. He had grown up on Valentine Avenue in North Memphis, in a narrow two-story house where the radiator knocked all winter, and the front porch sagged on one side from the weight of too many years and not enough repairs. His father, Gerald Webb, had worked 31 years on the floor of a Shelby County warehouse, lifting and stacking, and never complaining, because complaining cost energy that the family couldn't afford to waste. His mother, Ruth, had cleaned offices downtown 3 nights a week after her day shift at the school cafeteria. Marcus had understood from a very early age that in his neighborhood, dignity was not something the world handed you. It was something you constructed piece by piece with your own hands every single day, knowing that someone somewhere was always looking for a reason to take it apart. He joined the Memphis Police Department at 24. Not because he had no other options, he had a full scholarship offer from the University of Tennessee Law School, sitting on the kitchen table the same week he picked up his badge. He joined because he believed with the particular stubbornness of a young man who had seen too much, that the law was supposed to mean something in places like Valentine Avenue, that it could mean something if the right people decided to make it so. 27 years later, Deputy Chief Marcus Webb had become one of those people. He had worked every district in Memphis. He had made lieutenant faster than anyone in his precinct's history. He had built relationships across the city, with community organizers, with federal prosecutors, with civil rights attorneys, with the kind of people who showed up at city council meetings and didn't leave until someone answered their questions. He had also buried 2 partners, testified in 11 federal corruption trials, and survived one shooting that left a scar along his left forearm that he never talked about in public. 3 weeks ago, the Tennessee Office of the Attorney General had called him directly. The assignment was straightforward in description, complicated in execution. For years, at minimum a decade, possibly longer, complaints had been accumulating against Judge Carl Denton of Courtroom 4, a Shelby County municipal court. Over 40 formal grievances, dozens of informal reports from legal aid attorneys, a pattern so consistent, so documented, and so completely ignored by the appropriate oversight bodies that it had begun to look less like negligence and more like protection. The AG's office needed someone to go inside, not as law enforcement, not with a badge or a warrant or an official capacity of any kind. They needed a private citizen, a black man specifically, because the data was impossible to ignore, to walk into Denton's courtroom, stand at that podium, and experience exactly what thousands of Memphis residents had experienced before him. Marcus had agreed without hesitation. He had one condition. He wanted to choose his own violation. His chief of staff, Agent Renee Caldwell Sharp, methodical 15 years in financial crimes investigation, had laughed when he told her his plan. Riding a bicycle without a helmet on a designated bike lane, a $75 municipal ordinance citation, the kind of thing a rookie cop wrote up on a slow Tuesday to fill a quota. "You could have jaywalked," Renee said. "Too obvious," Marcus replied. "I want something clean, something where the law is actually on my side. Because if Denton does what we think he does, he won't care about the facts. He'll just see who's standing there." On the morning of this hearing, Marcus stood in front of the bathroom mirror in his apartment and made deliberate choices. He pulled on the faded Memphis Tigers t-shirt he had owned since 2009, dark jeans slightly worn at the knee, a pair of Nike Air Force Ones with a small scuff on the left toe that he did not clean. No watch, no rings, no indication of anything beyond what the eye could immediately assume. He took the bus. Not because he had to, his department vehicle was parked in the garage downstairs. He took the bus because he wanted to feel the morning, the way the people who came to Denton's courtroom every day felt it. Tired, squeezed in, carrying something heavy before the day had even properly started. Renee had fitted the recording device herself the night before. It was embedded in the second button of the t-shirt, a miniaturized audio capture unit used in federal surveillance operations, capable of picking up a whisper from 12 feet away in ambient noise. She had also arranged for a second device, a backup recorder in the sole of his left shoe. "Belt and suspenders," she said, pressing the button carefully into place. "You think I'll need both?" Marcus asked. Renee looked at him steadily. "I think Carl Denton has been doing this for 16 years because he's never once been recorded by someone who knew what to do with the recording." Marcus had nodded, said nothing. On the bus ride downtown, he pulled out his phone and read through Denton's file one more time. Not the formal record he had that memorized. He read the handwritten statements, the ones from people who had sat in that wooden chair across from Denton and walked out with less than they'd walked in with. An elderly man who had sold his television to pay a fine for a cracked taillight. A single mother who had missed her child's school play because Denton had held her for 3 hours over an unpaid parking citation from 2019. A 19-year-old who had walked into that courtroom with a minor noise violation and walked out with a suspended license and a contempt charge because he had asked politely what the charge was based on. The bus stopped on 3rd Street. Marcus folded the file, put it in his back pocket, and stood up. Through the scratched window of the bus, he could see the limestone facade of the municipal courthouse. Gray and solid and indifferent, the way buildings that have processed too much human suffering tend to look after a while. He stepped off the bus into the thin October morning air. His recorder was running. Renee's voice came through the small earpiece, barely audible. "Denton's been on the bench since 7:52. He's already hit 3 people with maximum fines. You're number 21 on the docket." Marcus buttoned his shirt, adjusted the second button carefully, and started walking. 22, he said quietly, "by the time I get there." He pushed through the heavy courthouse door and disappeared inside. Courtroom 4. A smelled like burnt coffee and dread. Marcus took a seat in the 3rd row from the back, in the middle of the wooden bench, between a heavy-set woman in a blue nurse's uniform who kept checking her watch, and a teenage boy who was staring at the floor with the expression of someone trying very hard not to cry. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed at a frequency that felt designed to wear people down. 2 of the 4 panels above the jury box flickered intermittently, throwing the left side of the room into a rhythm of shadow and harsh white light. The walls were paneled in laminate that was supposed to look like oak and succeeded only in looking tired. The American flag in the corner had a bent pole that made it lean slightly toward the judge's bench, as if even the flag had learned to defer to Carl Denton. Marcus settled in, folded his hands, watched. Denton was already mid-case when Marcus arrived. The man standing at the defendant's podium was in his early 70s, slight and stooped, wearing a short-sleeved collared shirt that had been ironed carefully, despite clearly being washed too many times. His name, Marcus learned from the docket sheet being passed along the row, was Ernest Holloway. The charge, municipal code violation 14-72. Grass and vegetation height exceeding 4 inches, fine $400. Ernest Holloway's lawn had been 3 inches too tall. "Mr. Holloway," Denton said, not looking up from his papers, "you've had 60 days to address this citation. Why are we here?" Ernest's voice was soft and a little unsteady. "Your Honor, I had a hip replacement in August. I couldn't push the mower myself, and I couldn't afford to hire someone until my son—" "I didn't ask for your medical history," Denton said flatly. "I asked why the violation wasn't corrected." "Yes, sir, I understand, but I have a letter from my doctor right here that confirms—" Denton waved his hand. The gesture was small and total, the way you'd wave away a fly. "This is a code compliance hearing, not a hospital visit. The grass was too long. The city notified you. You didn't act. That's the entirety of what matters here." He scribbled something on his notepad. $400. Pay the clerk." Ernest Holloway stood very still for a moment. Then he reached into a worn canvas tote bag and pulled out a small glass jar. It was the kind of jar that once held pasta sauce, the label long since peeled away, the glass clouded with age. Inside it were coins and folded bills packed tightly, the accumulated evidence of a very long and careful effort to prepare for exactly this moment. He set it on the edge of the podium. His hands were shaking. "I have $67, Ernest said quietly. "I've been putting it aside since September. I can bring the rest by the end of the month, I give you my word." Denton looked at the jar. Something shifted in his expression, not softness, not empathy, more like contempt sharpened to a point. "You brought a jar of coins to my courtroom." "Yes, sir, it's all I have right now." "That's not even close." Denton's voice was flat and cold. "You think I have time to count your piggy bank money?" He turned to the bailiff without looking at Ernest again. "Hold him until a family member brings the balance. Next case." Ernest Holloway picked up his jar with both hands. He stood there for a moment holding it against his chest, a 70-year-old man in a carefully ironed shirt, looking at a judge who had already moved on to the next page of his docket. He was led to the side room at 9:14 in the morning. He would not be released until 1:47 in the afternoon. 4 hours and 33 minutes for $333. In the third row, Marcus Webb pressed his pen so hard against his notepad that the tip went through the paper. The morning continued. A young woman named Sophia Reyes stood at the podium 20 minutes later, holding a toddler on her hip because she had no one to leave him with. She had 3 unpaid parking citations from 2022 totaling $180 accumulated during a period when she had been working double shifts at a hospital laundry facility and parking in a zone that the city had changed without adequate notice. She had documentation. She had a letter from her employer. She had a payment plan proposal printed out and paper-clipped neatly together. Denton gave her 45 seconds. "You were notified. You didn't pay. Your license is suspended pending full payment of the balance, plus a late processing fee of $90. He stamped the paper. "The child doesn't change the math, Ms. Reyes." Sophia Reyes walked out of the courtroom without her license. She would lose her job 11 days later because the laundry facility required employees to drive a delivery route twice a week, and she could no longer legally do so. Then came Deshaun Carter, 22 years old, cited for a noise violation outside his apartment building at 11 p.m. on a Saturday. He had been sitting on the front steps listening to music on a Bluetooth speaker. The citation was for $95. He asked Denton politely which specific ordinance he had violated. Denton cited him for contempt. "You don't interrogate this bench," Denton said, and the extra $200 fine came down before Deshaun could draw his next breath. Marcus watched all of it. He watched the way Denton's posture changed when white defendants approached the podium, a slight relaxation in the shoulders, a marginally slower cadence, the occasional dry joke that passed for leniency. He watched the way Denton's jaw tightened the moment a black or brown face appeared before him, the way his hand moved toward the gavel before the defendant had even finished their first sentence. It was not unconscious bias. It was not bad temperament. It was practiced, deliberate, efficient. It was a system, and Carl Denton was its architect. Marcus turned to a clean page in his notepad and wrote 3 words at the top: pattern, documented, actionable. Then the clerk called the next name on the docket. Case number 1147, City of Memphis versus Marcus Webb. Marcus closed his notepad, slid it into his back pocket, and stood up. Marcus walked down the center aisle slowly, not the walk of a man who was nervous, not the walk of a man performing confidence he didn't feel. It was the walk of someone who had made a decision a long time ago about how he would carry himself in rooms that were designed to make him feel small, and had never once revisited that decision. He stopped at the defendant's podium, placed both hands loosely on the edge, stood straight. Judge Carl Denton did not look up. He was writing something on a legal pad, his pen moving with the brisk self-importance of a man who wanted everyone present to understand that their time was worth considerably less than his. He let 30 seconds pass, then 40. The courtroom was silent except for the flickering hum of the overhead lights and the faint sound of someone's child shifting on a wooden bench in the gallery. Denton finally glanced up. His eyes moved across Marcus in the efficient, dismissive way they had moved across everyone who had stood at that podium today. The faded t-shirt, the worn jeans, the scuffed shoes, the absence of a briefcase, a folder, a lawyer, anything that might signal resources or resistance. His expression settled into something comfortable. "Marcus Webb," Denton said, reading from the docket. "Bicycle Ordinance Violation Section 21-44. No helmet in a posted zone." He set the paper down. "How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor." Denton's pen paused for just a fraction of a second. Then it resumed moving. "On what basis?" "On the basis that Section 21-44 applies specifically to unmarked public roadways," Marcus said, his voice level and clear. "The citation was issued on Shelby Greenway, which is a designated recreational trail under Memphis Parks Commission jurisdiction. The helmet ordinance does not apply to designated recreational trails under Tennessee Code Annotated 55-52-106 subsection C." The pen stopped. Denton looked up fully this time. The comfortable expression was still there, but something behind it had shifted slightly, the way a door shifts in its frame when the temperature changes, not open, not obviously different, but no longer quite as settled as it was. "Where did you get that from?" Denton said. His tone was almost curious. Almost. "Tennessee Code Annotated, Your Honor. It's publicly available." "Is it?" Denton leaned back. "And you found this where online a legal advice forum, your cousin who watches too much television?" He smiled at his own joke. Nobody in the gallery laughed. "Let me explain something to you about how the law works in practice versus how it reads on a website. The officer observed a violation. He issued a citation. That citation is before this court. Your opinion about which subsection applies is not a legal defense. It's a hobby. With respect, Your Honor, the specific statutory language, I didn't ask you to continue. Denton's voice dropped a register. Not louder. Quieter. The quieter was worse. I have been sitting on this bench for 16 years. I have heard every variation of the speech you're about to give. A man walks in here with no legal training, no attorney, no actual understanding of courtroom procedure, and he's decided that 45 minutes on Google makes him qualified to challenge a citation in my court. He paused, tilted his head slightly. You know what that tells me? Marcus waited. It tells me you've never faced a real consequence in a courtroom before. Because if you had, you'd know better than to stand there and waste my time. I'm not wasting your time, Your Honor. I'm asserting my right to present a defense. You're right. Denton repeated the word the way someone might repeat a word in a foreign language they found faintly ridiculous. Let me tell you something about rights. Rights have paperwork. Rights have case law. Rights have attorneys who know how to argue them properly. He gestured at Marcus's clothing with a small, slow motion of his hand. You walked in here looking like you just came off a 12-hour shift at a loading dock. You don't have an attorney. You've got 2 paragraphs you memorized from a legal website. That is not a defense. That is a performance. The woman in the nurse's uniform, 2 rows behind Marcus, made a small, involuntary sound, like something being pressed out of her. Marcus did not move. He kept his hands loose on the podium edge, kept his voice at exactly the same register it had been when he started. The Greenway designation is on file with the Memphis Parks Commission, Marcus said. I have the documentation here, Shulman, if the court would like to review it. He reached into his back pocket and produced a single folded sheet of paper. Clean. Precise. Printed that morning. Denton stared at it. Then something happened behind his eyes. A rapid recalibration. A flash of something that might have been uncertainty if it had been allowed to develop. And then his hand came down flat on the desk, hard and final, the same way it had come down on Ernest Holloway's jar of coins, and Sophia Reyes's paper-clipped payment plan, and every piece of evidence that every person who had stood at that podium had tried to offer him today. I'm not interested in your documents, Denton said. I find you guilty. $75 fine. And since you want to come in here and play attorney with a government-issue bench, I'm adding a contempt citation. $350. Total fine is $425 payable to the clerk immediately. He picked up his gavel. Do you understand? Picked up his gavel. Do you? Marcus looked at him for a long, quiet moment. I understand perfectly, Your Honor, he said. There was something in the way he said it. Not anger, not defeat. Something that sat below both of those things, patient and absolute, the way bedrock sits below soil. Several people in the gallery heard it and shifted in their seats without knowing why. Denton brought the gavel down. Pay the clerk. Next case. Marcus turned from the podium. As he walked toward the clerk's window, his right hand moved to his shirt, and his index finger pressed lightly against the second button, not to adjust it, not to check it, just to confirm it was still there. It was. The clerk's window was a small rectangular opening, cut into the wall beside the jury box, framed by scratched plexiglass, and a metal tray that had been worn smooth by years of hands pushing money across it. The woman behind the window was Linda Park, according to the nameplate fixed to the ledge. She was in her mid-40s with careful eyes and the particular stillness of someone who had learned, over a long career in this building, to make herself as unobtrusive as possible. She looked at Marcus when he approached. Not the way the others in the room looked at him with pity or relief, that it wasn't them or the careful avoidance of people who didn't want to get involved. She looked at him the way someone looks at a person they are trying to figure out. like the pieces in front of her didn't quite arrange themselves into the picture she expected. Marcus placed his hands on the counter and spoke quietly. "I need to pay the fine." Linda Park nodded, pulled up the docket on her screen. Her fingers moved over the keyboard with practiced efficiency. Then she stopped, looked at the screen, looked at Marcus. $425, she said. Her voice was carefully neutral. "I know." Marcus reached into his back pocket and produced a wallet. He opened it and removed a card. He placed it on the metal tray and slid it through the opening. Linda Park picked it up. It was a Platinum Visa card, the kind issued to federal law enforcement personnel through the government's Professional Expense Program. The name on it was embossed in clean silver letters, Marcus D. Webb. She processed the payment without comment, but her eyes moved to the card one more time before she handed it back. "I'll also need an itemized receipt," Marcus said. "Line item breakdown of both charges, the original citation amount and the contempt citation listed separately with their specific municipal code references." Linda Park began printing without being asked twice. "And I need written confirmation," Marcus continued, keeping his voice low and even, "that the court recorder was operational during my entire hearing. I'd like that confirmed in writing by the court reporter before I leave the building." Linda Park's fingers paused over the keyboard for just a moment. Then she resumed typing. "I'll get you that confirmation. Thank you." Marcus folded the receipt carefully and placed it in his front pocket. Then he raised his voice by precisely the amount needed for the sound to reach the court reporter's desk, 8 feet away, without sounding like a performance. "I'd also like to formally request a certified copy of the complete transcript of my hearing, everything from the moment my case number was called to the moment the gavel came down. Every word spoken on the record." The court reporter, an older man named Walter, looked up from his stenography machine. He was the kind of man who had sat in that chair so long that the chair had begun to conform to him rather than the other way around. He had seen everything in 16 years of recording Denton's courtroom. He had transcribed sentences that had made him go home and pour himself 2 fingers of bourbon before dinner. He had learned not to react, not to editorialize, not to carry the courtroom home with him, but he held Marcus's gaze for a long moment before he nodded. Slow, deliberate, like a man confirming something more than a clerical request. From across the room, Denton's voice cut through the air. "You want a transcript?" He had been watching from the bench, one case already called up in his absence of attention. He leaned forward now, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. "Go right ahead. Waste more of your money. Maybe you can frame it. Put it on your wall. A souvenir from the one time you thought you knew the law." Several people in this gallery kept their eyes down. One man near the window closed his eyes briefly, like a person enduring something they had given up, hoping would stop. Marcus collected his receipt, folded it once more, and placed it in his shirt pocket. Then he turned and looked at Denton for the last time in that room. He didn't glare. He didn't perform outrage. He looked at Carl Denton with the same expression a structural engineer might use to examine a bridge that has been bearing too much weight for too long. Not with anger, but with the clinical certainty of someone who already knows exactly where the fractures are and exactly how much pressure it will take. "Enjoy the rest of your morning, Your Honor," Marcus said. He walked out of courtroom 4A without looking back. The heavy door swung shut behind him with a soft final sound. In the corridor, he walked 30 feet from the door, turned into an alcove beside the water fountain, and stood still for a moment. He pressed 2 fingers against his shirt over the second button. Still running. Then he reached up and touched the small earpiece. "Renee," her voice came back immediately. "I heard everything. Full capture on both devices. Audio is clean. The contempt charge is on record, word for word. He cited the amount on the record unprompted with zero legal basis. Marcus, she paused. He did everything we needed him to do. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Down the corridor, through the closed door of Courtroom 4A, he could hear Denton's voice beginning again. The same cadence, the same flat authority. The next case, the next person, the next $425 extracted from someone who couldn't afford it and couldn't fight back. Not for much longer. Pull the team together for tonight, Marcus said. We start building the formal dossier tomorrow morning. Full documentation. Every case, every transcript, every complainant we can reach. Already started, Renee said. One more thing. Marcus straightened his shirt, adjusted the second button with 2 careful fingers. The Judicial Ethics Gala, Tennessee Law Enforcement Recognition Night. 3 weeks from Saturday at the Peabody. What about it? Make sure Judge Carl Denton gets an invitation. VIP, front table. He paused. And make sure it comes from the Attorney General's office directly. Make it look like the opportunity he's been waiting for his whole career. There was a brief silence on the line. Done, Renee said quietly. Marcus put his phone in his pocket and walked toward the exit. Behind him, the courthouse hummed along as it always had, processing people through its machinery. Somewhere inside Courtroom 4A, another name was being called. Another person was standing at that podium. Another fine was coming down. 3 weeks. 21 days. The trap was set. The conference room on the 4th floor of the Tennessee Attorney General's regional office in Memphis was not a glamorous space. It was a long rectangle with government-issue carpet, the color of old moss. A whiteboard that still held ghost traces of cases argued and closed years ago, and a folding table that had been extended to its full length and covered end to end with files, printed transcripts, spreadsheets, and photographs. 3 laptops were open. 2 printers ran almost continuously for the first 4 days. Empty coffee cups accumulated along the windowsill like a timeline of late nights. Marcus's team worked in focused, practiced silence. They had done this kind of work before of financial crimes, civil rights violations, systemic misconduct. They knew how to build a case that couldn't be dismantled, argued down, or quietly buried by a review board that owed someone a favor. They had 3 weeks. They used every hour. By the end of day 2, the number that defined everything was already on the whiteboard in red marker. $2,300,000. $2.3 million in municipal fines collected through Courtroom 4A over a 5-year audit period. Cross-referenced against census data by address, cross-referenced again against defendant names and self-reported demographics from intake forms. The pattern was not subtle. It was not something you had to squint to see. It was explicit, documented, and consistent across 60 months of court records. 81% of maximum fines had been levied against Black and Latino defendants. White defendants in comparable cases received maximum fines at a rate of 11%. 47 of Denton's rulings had been overturned on appeal. 43 of those 47 involved defendants of color. In 31 of those cases, the appellate court had used the phrase clear procedural error. In 9 cases, the phrase denial of due process appeared in the written decision. Not one of those decisions had triggered a formal review of Denton's conduct. Not one. Then Renee found Aaron Michaels. She found him through a cross-reference of Bar Association disciplinary records and a complaint filing from 2019. Aaron Michaels had been 28 years old, 18 months out of Memphis Law School, working for a nonprofit legal aid organization that served low-income clients in Shelby County. He had watched Denton's courtroom for 6 months. He had documented what he saw with the careful, methodical thoroughness of a young attorney who still believed that the system would correct itself if you gave it the right information. His complaint had been 34 pages, 12 exhibits, 11 witness statements. The Tennessee Commission on Judicial Conduct had responded with a letter that was 4 paragraphs long. The operative sentence was in the 3rd paragraph. After preliminary review, the Commission finds insufficient grounds to proceed to formal investigation. No follow-up, no explanation. No follow-up, no record of any witness being contacted. 91 days after that letter was sent, a complaint was filed against Aaron Michaels with the Tennessee Board of Professional Responsibility. The complaint alleged that Michaels had made unauthorized contact with sitting judicial staff during his legal aid work, a vague, procedurally murky accusation that was nonetheless sufficient to trigger a review. The review took 11 months. At the end of it, Aaron Michaels' law license was suspended for 18 months for conduct prejudicial to the administration of justice. The complaint had been filed by the Administrative Office of Shelby County Municipal Court Division 4, Carl Denton's division. Renee set the file on the table in front of Marcus at 9 p.m. on a Wednesday. She didn't say anything. She just placed it there and stepped back. Marcus read through it twice. Then he set it down and sat very still for a long moment, looking at the wall above the whiteboard. Aaron Michaels was currently working the overnight security shift at a commercial complex in Nashville. Renee had found a phone number. Marcus called it himself at 10:30 that night, identifying himself by name and title. There was a long silence on the line after he finished explaining why he was calling. Then Aaron Michaels said very quietly, "I still have my copy of the complaint. I kept everything." "I know," Marcus said. "I'd like you to come to Memphis soon." The third piece came from the AG's Forensic Accounting Unit, and it was the piece that made the entire team go quiet when it was presented. Every Q4 period, October, November, December, fines issued from Courtroom 4A increased by an average of 340% compared to the preceding 3 quarters. The spike was consistent across every year of the 5-year audit window. Consistent, predictable, and perfectly timed to coincide with the Shelby County budget reconciliation period, during which municipal court revenue was applied against departmental shortfalls. Inside the deleted email archive recovered from the account of Denton's former court administrator, a single internal memo had survived. It had no letterhead, no signature, no date. It contained 1 paragraph. Q4 targets, minimum $180,000 from municipal fines. Prioritize repeat offenders and unrepresented defendants. Unrepresented defendants. The words sat in the middle of that sentence like a stone dropped in still water. It meant people who couldn't afford lawyers. It meant people who didn't know their rights. It meant people who would pay what they were told to pay because they had no mechanism to push back, no language for what was happening to them, and no reason to believe that anyone in that building was on their side. Ernest Holloway was on the list. He had appeared before Denton's court 7 times in 8 years. Total fines paid $6,400. Current monthly income from Social Security retirement, $1,100. Marcus drove to Ernest Holloway's house on a Thursday evening. It was a small house on a quiet street, the lawn immaculate, a detail that landed somewhere painful. Ernest answered the door in a cardigan, surprised, cautious. Marcus introduced himself, said he needed to talk. They sat in the living room for an hour and 40 minutes. At one point, Ernest went to the bedroom and came back carrying a shoebox. Inside it, arranged in chronological order, held together by a single rubber band that had been replaced so many times the cardboard beneath it was grooved, were 8 years of court receipts. His hands shook slightly as he set the box on the coffee table. Marcus looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Ernest Holloway. "Would you be willing to tell your story?" Marcus said, "in front of the people who need to hear it." Ernest Holloway looked at the shoebox, at the receipts, at the sum of 8 years of a fixed income being quietly bled away by a man in a robe who had never once looked at him like he was a person. "Yes," Ernest said simply. "I've been waiting a long time for someone to ask." The Peabody Hotel in downtown Memphis had been standing since 1925, and in that time it had hosted presidents, musicians, civil rights leaders, and every variety of powerful person the Mid-South had produced. Its grand ballroom had witnessed things worth remembering and things worth forgetting, and its walls, if they could speak, would have described a city in permanent, complicated negotiation with its own history. On the third Saturday of November, the ballroom had been transformed for the Tennessee Law Enforcement and Judicial Recognition Night. Crystal chandeliers threw warm light across 600 chairs arranged around 60 tables draped in white linen. The stage at the far end held a podium flanked by 2 large screens. Flowers had been arranged with the kind of precision that suggested a significant budget. The air smelled of prime rib and expensive perfume, and the particular self-satisfaction of powerful people gathered among their own kind. Judge Carl Denton arrived at 7:14 p.m. He had purchased a new tuxedo for the occasion. Hickey Freeman charcoal with a satin lapel bought from a store on Poplar Avenue 3 days prior. He had also purchased new dress shoes, which were giving him a slight blister on his right heel that he was choosing to ignore because the shoes looked exactly right, and looking right was the entire point of tonight. He handed his coat to the attendant at the door, collected his name badge, Judge Carl Denton 5, IP Guest Table 3, and stepped into the ballroom with the deliberate ease of a man who had rehearsed his entrance, if not consciously, then in every small interaction he had conducted over the past 2 decades. This was his night. Not officially, there were others being recognized, others giving speeches, but Denton had been working toward this room for years. The appellate seat he had been pursuing required visibility, required the right people to see him in the right context, required an evening exactly like this one where he could from table to table make the right impressions, remind the right people that Carl Denton was serious, experienced, and deserving of elevation. He had already identified 3 appellate judges he planned to approach before dinner was served. He collected a glass of scotch from a passing tray and moved into the room. For the first 40 minutes, everything went according to his design. He found the first appellate judge, a man named Patterson, near the bar, and spent 12 minutes in what he considered a productive conversation about judicial temperament and the importance of firm sentencing in lower courts. Patterson had smiled at intervals and said several times and excused himself for the buffet, which Denton interpreted as a positive sign. He found the second judge, a woman named Carver, near the floral arrangements, and managed 8 minutes before her assistant materialized at her elbow with a message that required her attention elsewhere. He was navigating toward the third judge, a federal circuit appointment named Hollins, when he stopped. Near the velvet rope at the edge of the stage area, surrounded by a small cluster of people that included the Shelby County District Attorney, a state senator from the Judiciary Committee, and the regional director of the FBI, was a woman in a deep burgundy evening gown. The gown was floor-length, precisely fitted, the kind of garment that announced its own cost without advertising it. Diamond earrings, a single bracelet. Hair arranged with the kind of understated elegance that took considerable effort to appear effortless. She was speaking, and the people around her were listening, with the particular attentiveness of people who understood that the person talking was someone whose words carried weight. Denton's brain registered her face and then did something unusual. It stalled. He knew her. He was certain of it. The recognition was there, present and insistent, but the context was wrong, wildly, impossibly wrong. Because the face he was recognizing belonged to a woman he had last seen in a faded t-shirt and worn jeans, standing at a defendant's podium in Courtroom 4A, being fined $425 for riding a bicycle. His scotch glass stopped halfway to his mouth. The district attorney leaned toward her and said something, and she laughed a genuine laugh, not performed the laugh of someone comfortable enough in a room to find it actually funny. The state senator touched her arm briefly, in the way people touch the arms of those they genuinely respect. Denton set his glass down on the nearest table. He straightened his tuxedo jacket. He told himself firmly and with conviction that he was mistaken, that it was a resemblance, that the woman from his courtroom had been nobody. The entire point of that courtroom, the entire architecture of his power within it, was that the people who came before him were nobody. He walked toward her anyway, not because he was certain, because he needed to be. He arrived at the edge of the group and spoke before he had fully processed the wisdom of doing so. "Excuse me," he said loudly enough that the district attorney stopped mid-sentence. Denton looked directly at the woman in the burgundy gown. "I know you. You were in my courtroom." The small group went still. The woman turned toward him slowly, with the unhurried composure of someone who had been expecting this moment and had decided exactly how she would inhabit it. "Yes, Judge Denton," she said. "I was. What are you doing here?" The question came out harder than he intended. "This is a private event. Secured. For legal and law enforcement professionals." He heard himself continuing even as some distant, quieter part of his brain began sending signals he wasn't receiving. "You can't just walk into a gala because you put on a dress, Carl." The district attorney's voice was low and precise, the single word carrying the weight of significant discomfort. The state senator had taken a small step back, the physical equivalent of removing himself from proximity to what was about to happen. Denton pressed forward. "I'm going to need to see your credentials or I'm going to ask security to—" "Judge Denton." The voice came from behind him. He turned. Standing 3 feet away in full-dress uniform, the deep navy of the Memphis Police Department, the silver insignia of deputy chief on his collar, 7 service commendations on his chest, was the man from the bicycle citation, the man from the faded Memphis Tigers t-shirt, the man he had called unrepresented, untrained, someone who had rolled off a bus stop bench. Marcus Webb looked at Carl Denton with an expression of complete, settled calm. "I see you've already met the keynote speaker," Marcus said. Denton's mouth opened. Nothing came out. From across the ballroom, the lights began to dim. The MC's voice rose over the sound system, warm and projecting. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you'll please find your seats, tonight's program is about to begin." Denton stood in the dimming light, his new tuxedo suddenly feeling like something he had been dressed in by someone else for a purpose he hadn't understood when he put it on. He found his way to table 3, front and center, exactly where they had put him. He reached into his jacket pocket for his room key. The card read, "Room 1404. Tucked behind it was the small note the front desk attendant had slipped in with his welcome envelope. He hadn't read it until now. It said in neat handwriting, "Welcome to room 1404. Note, this is actually the 13th floor. Elevator button reads 14. Denton stared at the note. No hotel staff had ever written that. No trained front desk attendant in any hotel anywhere in the world would ever write that. It made no sense. He put it back in his pocket. His hands were not entirely steady. On the stage, the first spotlight came on. The spotlight found her before the applause did. Marcus Webb stood at the edge of the stage just beyond the curtain and watched the woman in the burgundy gown walk to the podium with the unhurried certainty of someone who had stood in front of difficult rooms her entire career and had never once needed the room to be easy. Agent Renee Caldwell stood beside him, arms folded, eyes forward. The MC's introduction had taken 4 minutes. It had covered the highlights: 27 years in law enforcement, the appointment to deputy chief, the quiet, years-long work of building corruption cases that had resulted in 11 federal convictions. It had mentioned the community. It had mentioned North Memphis. It had mentioned the word integrity 4 times, which was 3 more times than most introductions. In that ballroom used it, and every time it landed, Marcus had watched the people at table 3 shift slightly in their chairs. Now the woman at the podium waited for the applause to settle. She set both hands on the lectern. She looked out across 600 people and let the silence build for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to be felt, short enough not to be theatrical. "Thank you," she said. Her name was Deputy Chief Angela Reeves, and she had been Marcus Webb's partner for 11 of his 27 years on the force. She was 61 days from her own retirement. When Marcus had called her 3 weeks ago and asked if she would accept the recognition award on behalf of the department and deliver a prepared address, she had listened to the full explanation in silence and then said simply, "Tell me what time to be there." "I want to talk tonight," Angela began, "about the courts." The room settled. "Not the courts most of you work in. Not the appellate benches or the federal courtrooms or the circuit courts where the cases you argue have names that end up in law journals." She paused. "I want to talk about the municipal courts, the first courts, the ones that most people in this country will ever see if they see any court at all. The courtrooms where people go when they've been cited for a cracked taillight or a noise violation or a bicycle ordinance, or a lawn that grew 3 inches too tall." At table 3, Carl Denton had stopped pretending to look at the program booklet. He was very still. "3 weeks ago," Angela continued, "a colleague of mine conducted a first-hand observation of one of those courts. He dressed in plain clothes. He took public transit. He sat in the gallery and he watched. And then he stood at the defendant's podium himself as a private citizen, and he experienced what thousands of residents of this city experience every single year." She reached beneath the podium and produced a bound document. Dark blue cover, the seal of the Tennessee Attorney General's office embossed in the lower right corner. "I have here the certified transcript of that hearing. I'd like to read a few lines directly from the record." The room was absolutely silent. Not the polite silence of an audience waiting for the next portion of a program. The dense, pressurized silence of 600 people understanding simultaneously that something real was happening. Angela opened the transcript. Her voice, when she read, was flat and precise, and entirely without editorializing, which made it worse. "You people always have an excuse. Pay the fine and sit down before I double it." Someone at a table near the back made a sound. It was quickly suppressed. "What did they teach you, or did anyone bother you walked in here looking like you just rolled off a bus stop bench and you're going to stand there and lecture me about the law?" A federal judge 2 tables from the stage leaned toward the woman beside him and said something very quietly. She did not respond. She was watching the podium. "People like you come in here thinking this is a debate club. You lost before you walked through that door." Angela closed the transcript with a sound like a gavel strike. "The citizen who stood at that podium," she said, "was cited for contempt for politely requesting the opportunity to present documentary evidence. He was fined $425 for a bicycle ordinance violation on a designated recreational trail, a location explicitly exempted from that ordinance under Tennessee Code Annotated 55-52-106. She paused. He paid the fine. He collected his receipt. He requested the certified transcript and the court recording before he left the building. She reached beneath the podium a second time and placed a bound dossier beside the transcript. It was 78 pages. The AG seal appeared again on the cover this time, accompanied by the seal of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. "This document," Angela said, "contains 10 years of documented misconduct from the presiding judge of that hearing. 47 overturned rulings. A forensic audit showing $2.3 million in disproportionate fines levied predominantly against Black and Latino defendants. A recovered internal memo establishing a quarterly revenue target to be met by prioritizing." And I am quoting directly, unrepresented defendants, and the documented retaliatory disbarment of a young attorney who filed a formal complaint about this judge's conduct in 2019. She looked up from the podium. This dossier was submitted to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and the Office of the Attorney General this morning. It is now an active investigative record. She lifted her eyes to the front tables. The judge whose words I just read to you, and whose conduct is documented in this filing, is present in this room tonight. His name is Carl Denton. He is sitting at table 3, 600 heads turned. Carl Denton did not stand. He did not speak. The color had left his face so completely and so quickly that the man beside him, a municipal court administrator who had attended the gala for 12 consecutive years, actually leaned toward him with the instinctive concern of someone who thought he might be witnessing a medical event. Denton gripped the edge of the table. The federal judge, who had been Denton's primary networking target for the evening, had pushed his chair back several inches, creating a visible gap between himself and table 3 that was not subtle and was not meant to be. At the side of the stage, Marcus Webb watched Carl Denton's face in the spotlight that had found him without permission. He didn't feel satisfaction. He felt something quieter and more durable than that. The feeling of a thing that had been wrong for a very long time beginning finally to be corrected. Angela Reeves gathered her documents. She looked out across the ballroom one final time. "The robe," she said, "is not a crown. It is a trust. And when that trust is broken systematically, deliberately, against the people least able to fight back, it is the obligation of everyone in this room to respond." She stepped back from the podium. The applause that followed was not the polite, rhythmic applause of a formal event. It was the uneven, urgent sound of people who had been given permission to react to something they had just been shown. At table 3, Carl Denton sat in the noise and the light and did not move. Carl Denton did not wait for dessert. He stood from table 3 while the applause was still running, while people were still turning to look at him, and then turning away while the federal judge 2 seats over had pulled his chair another inch in the wrong direction. He stood with the stiff, mechanical movement of a man whose body was executing commands that his mind had not fully authorized, buttoned his tuxedo jacket by habit, and walked toward the nearest exit. He did not make it to the door. 2 journalists were positioned near the exit, not by accident, not by coincidence. Renee Caldwell had made 3 phone calls the week before to reporters she trusted at outlets that had been following the municipal court beat for years. She had told them only that something significant would be announced at the gala, and that they should be near the exits when it was. The first camera flash hit Denton before he had fully cleared the ballroom threshold. He stopped, raised one hand reflexively. The gesture photographed badly, it looked like a man flinching, which was accurate. "Judge Denton, do you have a response to the allegations presented tonight?" "Judge Denton, the TBI filing names you specifically. Would you like to comment?" He pushed past them without speaking and found the elevator bank. He rode up to the 14th floor, the 13th floor alone in silence, with the small note from the front desk still folded in his jacket pocket. He sat on the edge of the hotel bed in his new tuxedo and stared at the middle distance for a long time. By morning, the story was everywhere. The Memphis Commercial Appeal ran it on the front page with a photograph of Denton from the exit, hand raised, eyes caught mid-flinch, the ballroom light behind him, making the image look more dramatic than even the journalists had planned for. The headline read, "The Judge Who Didn't Know Who He Was Talking To." By noon, it had been picked up nationally. CNN ran the audio from Marcus's recording device, the clean, unambiguous capture of Denton's voice filling. Courtroom 4A, the contempt charge issued in real time, the fine levied without legal basis. The segment ran 4 times in the afternoon news cycle. By evening, the clip of Denton saying, "You people always have an excuse," had been viewed 11 million times across social media platforms. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation issued a formal statement at 10 a.m. Pending investigation of the conduct documented in the submitted dossier, Judge Carl Denton was suspended from his judicial duties effective immediately, without pay pursuant to Tennessee Code, annotated 17-5-302. Denton called 6 attorneys before noon. The first 4 didn't return his calls. The 5th called back and declined, citing a conflict of interest that Denton suspected was primarily a conflict of career interest. The 6th, a criminal defense attorney in Nashville, who had built his practice on taking cases others wouldn't touch, listened to Denton's account for 20 minutes and then told him his retainer would be $75,000 up front. Denton did not have $75,000 liquid. He had a mortgage on a house in East Memphis that was larger than he could comfortably afford a car lease payment, and a lifestyle calibrated to the salary and the anticipation of a promotion that was now not coming. He would represent himself at the preliminary TB Wine hearing. The bitter geometry of that fact, a man who had mocked self-representation from his bench for 16 years, now standing at a defendant's podium with no attorney, was noted by every journalist covering the story, and noted again and noted a third time. The formal Commission on Judicial Conduct hearing convened 19 days after the gala. Renee Caldwell had coordinated the witness list. It was not short. Ernest Holloway testified first. He wore his carefully ironed collared shirt. He brought the shoebox. When the commission chair asked him to describe the contents, Ernest opened the lid and removed the rubber-banded receipts, 8 years, 67 separate transactions, $6,400, and set them on the table in front of him with the slow precision of a man who had carried this weight for a very long time and was finally, at 70 years old, being given a surface to set it down on. A photographer from the Associated Press was permitted in the hearing room. The photograph of Ernest Holloway's hands, aged slightly trembling, placing the last receipt on top of the stack, ran on the front page of 14 newspapers. It won a regional press award 4 months later. Ernest Holloway did not know this. He was home watching television when his daughter called to tell him. Sophia Reyes testified through a translator for the first portion, then switched to English halfway through, because she said she wanted the commission to hear her without an intermediary. She described the toddler on her hip, the 45 seconds Denton had given her, the job she lost 11 days later. She did not cry. Her voice was completely steady, and somehow that was harder to listen to than tears would have been. Deshaun Carter testified last. He was 23 now. He had applied to the University of Memphis in the months since the contempt charge had been expunged from his record, following an emergency appellate review. He had been accepted. He was studying pre-law. He looked at Denton across the hearing room and said simply, "I just asked what I was being charged with. That's all I did." Denton sat at the defense table through all of it. The arrogance that had been the architecture of his courtroom for 16 years had been completely disassembled. What remained was a gray, diminished man in a suit that fit him correctly, but seemed somehow too large. The commission voted at 4:17 p.m. on a Tuesday, 11-0. Immediate removal from the bench. Referral to the Board of Professional Responsibility for disbarment proceedings based on documented constitutional violations. Forfeiture of judicial pension benefits in excess of the mandatory minimum. Denton stood when the decision was read. His chair scraped the floor. He looked at the commission chair for a long moment, as if searching for something to say that might change the geometry of what had just happened. He found nothing. He walked out of the hearing room and into a hallway where 3 journalists were waiting and 4 cameras were running, and he kept walking past all of them, through the building, out the front door, into the gray November afternoon, and into the remainder of a life that had just been fundamentally and permanently reconfigured. Marcus Webb was not in the hearing room when the decision came down. He had submitted his testimony in written form and returned to work. There was always more work, but Renee texted him the result at 4:19 p.m., 2 minutes after the vote. He read it, put the phone face down on his desk, picked up his pen, and went back to what he was doing. 8 months after the gavel came down in Courtroom 4A for the last time under Carl Denton's hand, Memphis was different in ways that were small and specific and real, not transformed. Cities do not transform in 8 months, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But different. The way a room is different after someone opens a window that has been painted shut for years, not changed in its dimensions, not suddenly made new, but breathing in a way it wasn't before. The Tennessee Municipal Court Transparency and Accountability Act had been signed into law on a Wednesday morning in March in a ceremony at the state capitol in Nashville that was attended by legislators, legal advocates, and 3 people who had once stood at Carl Denton's defendant's podium and been told their documentation didn't matter. The act mandated independent audits of all municipal court proceedings every 18 months, required body-worn audio capture in all courtrooms with public-facing dockets, and established a direct complaint pathway to the AG's office that bypassed the Commission on Judicial Conduct for cases involving sitting judges. Marcus Webb had drafted the first version of the bill on a legal pad in his office on the night Renee texted him the Commission's vote. He had worked on it for 6 weeks in the hours before and after his regular duties in the particular focused way he worked on things that mattered. He had consulted Aaron Michaels, who had driven up from Nashville for 2 of those working sessions, sitting across the conference room table with the careful, methodical thoroughness of a man who had lost a great deal and was rebuilding with the same tools that had cost him so much, the belief that documentation mattered, that the system could be made to work, that the right information given to the right people at the right time could change something real. Aaron Michaels's law license had been reinstated by the Board of Professional Responsibility in February, following a review that concluded in formal legal language that the original suspension had been the product of a retaliatory filing. The board's written decision used the phrase miscarriage of professional process in its second paragraph. It was dry administrative language, the kind of language that lives in filing cabinets and not in headlines, but it meant that Aaron Michaels could practice law again. He had returned to legal aid work. He had taken on 12 new clients in his first month back. He did not speak to the press about any of it. Carl Denton's disbarment had been finalized in April. The Board of Professional Responsibility's decision was 41 pages long and contained in its findings of fact a direct reference to the internal memo recovered from the deleted email archive, the one with the quarterly revenue targets, the one that ended with the instruction to prioritize unrepresented defendants. That document had not been prepared by Denton alone. 2 names appeared in the metadata of the original file. One of those names belonged to a county budget administrator who had resigned the week after the gala. A separate investigation into that individual was ongoing. Denton had filed for personal bankruptcy in June. The house in East Memphis was listed for sale. The car lease had been surrendered. He had applied for a position teaching paralegal studies at a community college in Germantown and had been offered the role pending a background check. The background check had returned results that led the college to withdraw the offer politely. In a letter that cited institutional policy regarding professional licensure requirements, he was not as far as anyone in the legal community knew employed. Marcus did not follow these developments closely. Renee sent him occasional updates because she believed he deserved to know, and he read them with the same quiet attention he gave to most things, and then he set them aside and moved on. On a Saturday in late June, he drove to North Memphis. He parked on Valentine Avenue in front of the narrow, two-story house where the radiator had knocked all winter and the porch had sagged on one side. The house belonged to someone else now had for years. The new owners had fixed the porch and painted it a clean, pale yellow that looked cheerful in the summer light. Marcus sat in his car for a moment looking at it. Then he got out and walked to the front steps, not of that house but of the house next door, where Mrs. Elaine Carter, who had been his mother's closest friend for 40 years, still lived and still kept a pot of coffee going from 6 a.m. until 10 p.m. on the theory that you never knew when someone might need a cup. She opened the door before he knocked. "I saw you sitting out there," she said. "Come in." He sat at her kitchen table and drank coffee, and they talked about his father, who had died 11 years ago, and about his mother, who had died 4 years after that, and about the neighborhood and what it had been and what it was now, and the complicated relationship between those two things. Mrs. Carter did not ask about the case or the gala or the new law or any of the things that had been in the papers. She asked if he was eating properly. She asked if he was sleeping. She asked with the directness of a woman who had known him since he was 7 years old and had no patience for indirect questions whether he was happy. He thought about it honestly before he answered. "I think I'm doing the work I was supposed to do," he said. She looked at him over her coffee cup. "That's not what I asked." He smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that arrived without being summoned. "I know." He left an hour later, walked back to his car, and sat for another moment looking at the pale yellow house. He thought about Ernest Holloway, who had received a court-ordered refund check for $6,400 and had, according to Renee's most recent update, used a portion of it to hire a lawn service for the remainder of the year. Not because he couldn't tend the lawn himself, but because he had decided at 70 years old that he had earned the right to sit on his porch on Saturday mornings and watch someone else push the mower. He thought about Sophia Reyes, who had her license back and her job back, and had 3 months ago enrolled in a paralegal certification program at Memphis Community College on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. He thought about Deshawn Carter, who was studying pre-law and who had sent Marcus a single text message the week after the commission hearing. No greeting, no context. Just 5 words. "Thank you for being there." Marcus had read that text 4 times before he put his phone away. He started the car. The engine turned over smoothly in the warm Memphis morning. Through the windshield, Valentine Avenue stretched ahead of him, familiar, complicated, imperfect, and still standing. The way places that have endured difficult things tend to stand. He pulled away from the curb and drove north. There is a kind of power that announces itself loudly, that wears its authority on the outside, that demands deference before it has earned respect. And then there is the other kind, the kind that is built over decades in the quiet accumulation of doing right by people who had no reason to expect it. Marcus Webb walked into that courtroom in a faded t-shirt, not because he was hiding who he was, but because he understood something that Carl Denton never did, that dignity is not a credential. It cannot be confirmed by a robe or revoked by a gavel. It belongs to the person standing at the podium just as completely as it belongs to the person sitting above them. The moment you forget that, the moment you start believing that the chair makes you the law, is the moment you begin building the architecture of your own collapse. If this story moved you, if you've ever stood in a room where someone with power tried to make you feel like you didn't belong, leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what this story meant to you. The people who need to hear these stories are everywhere, and every share gets it one step further. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is the kind of story we tell here, not for the algorithm, but because some truths deserve to travel further than the rooms where they happen.